Yeah.
All right.
I feel like I'm ready for bodies.
Who knows what's at the bottom of that lake?
Are you
You
becoming
find out November
the
1st.
Godfather?
Oh yeah, you told me about
They only want to
that.
call your discussion needs.
Okay, Rabosai, we are learning tonight Maseches Eruvin, the last blot in the nuns. We're learning Maseches Eruvin Daf Nun Tes, and we will go down almost to the bottom, about 8 lines or so from the bottom of Nun Tes and Beis. And tonight we're going to be speaking again about the measuring, though not the whole night, just for part of the night. And that's this new Mishnah here. And the Mishnah opens straight with a machlokes rishonim, a modidin elamin hamumche. You can only measure from the mumche. So what does that mean? We know the word mumche means an expert, and that's how Rashi explains here. The first Rashi on the Mishnah, 3/4 of the way down, Rashi says, a modidin ela mumche, baki b'medida, someone who really knows what he's doing. However, if you look at Tosfos on the bottom of the page, Tosfos writes, a modidin elamin hamumche, piresh Rabbeinu Chananel, derech yeshara umechuvenes keneged ha'ir umumche. Keneged ha'ir umumche milashon umumche al katev. Fine, but it doesn't mean that the mumche is not that you're a mumche. It's that your measuring needs to be exacting and parallel to the city. We'll see a nafkamina about for this a little bit later, but just suffice it to say at the moment that are we talking about a person or are we talking about the act of measuring has to be the mumches? My nafkamina, I'm a detail-oriented person. You tell me the concept, I'll figure it out. So I'll figure it out. No, you have to be a mumche, says Rashi. Or no, it doesn't. So that's got the machlokas in Rashi and the Rabbeinu Chananel and / Tosfos. Okay, so that's the opening line, is that there has to be some type of mumches. Riba lemakom echad u'mi lemakom acher. Let's say that a person's measuring and he measures twice, and one is riba, one measurement of the 2,000 amos comes out to be a little bit longer, and the other comes. Rashi changes the language. Look at the Dibur Hamaschil of Rashi. Yeah, he takes out a word. So Rashi, that could have just been his girsa, could have just been his text. This is like the methodology of Rashi Tosfos, like how, and they were only 2 generations apart. That was not very far. So not so simple in regards to the language, but then the Mishnah goes into some practical cases. Let's say that I am the measurer, be it a mumche or not, and riba lamakom echad u'mi lamakom acher. In one space, I did my measuring and I did my 40 rotations of 50 ropes, and it ended up being in place X, a little bit more. And I did it again, and it ended up being 100 almost shorter. So which one do I do? So this is a little bit to the conversation we were having last night. It says the Gemara, Shomin the Makom Shariba. We use the measurement that ended up being a little bit more. Now there is some lumdus here. The lumdus here is that, and this is actually based on a Tosefta, the Rishonim bring this up here, is that when you measure, you're supposed to pull the rope very tight. So if in doing so, you did your 40 rotations of your 40 measures of 50 on a rope, and you actually pulled it tight, it should be longer than if you don't pull it tight. So there's a bit of a svara here, but we'll see in the Gemara, it's also because we like to be makel by Eruv, by Tchum Shabbos. So that's approach number 1 in the Mishnah, that if you the same person measures and he comes up with 2 different measurements, the one that is a greater measurement will suffice for Tchumen, and that is a kula. 4 lines from the bottom, almost identical language, which the Gemara will pick up on. Riba le'echad u'mi'et le'echad. You can already kind of hear in the language itself what the difference will be. It's not one person measuring twice, but 2 different people. We'll discuss that a little bit more later. There, Shoman the Meruba. There too, we also follow the more lenient opinion, though the Gemara will provide a limitation on this. Ve'afilu eved, afilu shivcha, ne'eman and lomar, quote, ad kan tchum Shabbos. When it comes to an eved, when it comes to a shivcha, they are believed when it comes to saying ad kan tchum Shabbos. It's a very interesting idea. Besides the fact that there should be a line of demarcation, which it should be clear to us where the tchum ends and where it begins. Huh? Yeah.
It's in every direction, so there could be a stake in the ground.
Yeah, but it's permanent, meaning like your tchum doesn't change. You're just saying they should build a little thing, But it doesn't make a difference because we allow for edus here. What's blaringly missing from this is isha. That is assumed to be obvious in this case. Where's katan? Why isn't that mentioned either? So we have to. There's a whole diyun in the Rishonim here as well. Why were these 2 included? Why only avadim and shvachos? Because an eved is in the same category as an isha for some scenarios and a child for others. So there's what to touch on in the Rishonim here. So then the Mishnah concludes, and we're going to pick apart this Mishnah from almost from beginning to end. Let's start on the top of Nun Testament Aleph with the Gemara. Lamakom sheriba in, lamakom shemiet lo. Your math doesn't make sense. You said that the greater measurement is okay. We can use the greater measurement, but you can't carry even to the shorter measurement. just like a diuk in the words. Says the Gemara, no, of course that's not what it means. Obviously, if let's say the first measurement pulled out to 1900 and the second one pulled out to 1950. So your measure is 1950. So it says Gemara, Ema aflo makom shariba. Obviously, the larger space is what we're talking about, and of course, that's inclusive of the one that is shorter. What about this seemingly duplicate line? Riba le'echad u'mi'e le'echad hasu lamali. Why do I need the same line twice? Hainu hach. They sound like the same thing. Answers the Gemara, hachi kamar. Here is the pshat. Riba echad u'mi'et echad shomen lazeh shariba. This is almost identical to the Gemara, to the Mishnah. However, it says shomen lazeh shariba, to this one. And Rashi here says this exactly the way we would want him to. Second line of Rashi, Dibur hamaskil hachi kamar riba echad u'mi'et echad shemidadum shnei bnei adam. There were two people who measured zemid v'zeriba, and then we say that we even allow for the more lenient of the two, whichever had a greater measurement. However, Abaye says that there's a maximum differential that we would rely on the larger measurement. How does it work out? It says the Gemara as follows: Amar Abaye, ubilvad shelo yarba yoser mimidas ha'ir ba'alachsona. So we spoke about this pretty extensively. But let's say, for example, that this is my city right here. Okay. So now I'm the measurer, and I'm trying to make my tchum in the corner, and I make an error. And instead of making 2,000 amos this way, I do 2,000 amma on the angle. If I do 2,000 amma on the angle,
You get more.
this way, less. If I do 2,000 on the angle,
You're straight up.
then the right to left or the vertical is less. It's actually 1428. It's actually 1414, 1,414 amos. You shorten it because angles, the hypotenuse is always longer. Right. So let's say I had my, I'm trying to make my Tchum Shabbos here. So we know we're always marviach zavios. What's that?
More on the plexiglass.
Smaller than the size of plexiglass.
Stick more on the plexiglass, right?
What are you saying right
No,
now?
in the middle.
In the middle?
Right, now look at your hypotenuse.
I have a screen to worry about here. Okay. Here. This is Hirsch's point. If you are a bad measurer and you do the 2,000 amos this way, then this is only 1414, too short. If you're a good measurer, then this is 2,000 and this is 2,800. So that's the difference between the two is 2,000 versus 1414. So it's a very exacting number. Abaye says if the difference between the two people who measure is 586 amos or greater, then the numbers are off. You have to remeasure. We only allow for a margin of error of 586 amos because otherwise you're just really bad at measuring because something's off with the way that you're measuring. It doesn't make sense. Up to 586, we assume that it's a reasonable margin of error, which is remarkable because it's a 25% margin of error on the whole tchum.
So that's why you have to circle it? That's why you used the basketball the other night on Yom Tov?
No, the basketball was for something else. That was for how the sun sets. Yeah, that was for how the sun sets. No, this is just talking about regular tchum Shabbos, so making a square around your city in order to make a tchum. But some people do a better job of measuring. So Abaye says if two people are measuring and the results are different, as long as the margin of error is 580 or less, then you follow the opinion that was more lenient. If it's 600, you got to measure again. Somebody did something very, very wrong.
How did people measure back then?
Well, that was last night's document. They had 50 amma ropes made out of a specific material that they had to pull very tightly.
How much that 586 slack you were talking about? Right?
No, this is purely mathematical because you just put your 2,000 on the angle.
And we say we're made like that. That's what we say.
Yeah. Yeah.
That was like a ball.
Yeah. Okay, so that's how the Gemara answers here. And this brings us up to the two dots. And now we understand why we have the duplicate cases of Reba in our Mishnah. One is one person measuring twice, and the other is two different people measuring up to a margin, as Abaye adds, up to a margin of how to measure on the corners of 586 amos. Says the Gemara, Shelo Amru, quoting our Mishnah, Shelo Amru Chachamim Esadavar Lahachmer Elo Lahakel. Says the Gemara, but we have a brisa. We have another brisa that says the exact opposite. So when does this apply? Says the Gemara, Amar Ravina, Lo lahakel al divrei Torah, elo lahachmer al divrei Torah. We're not going to be lenient on dinei d'oraisa. We're always going to be machmer on dinei d'oraisa, even besafik, of course, as we know. With tchum and d'rabanan. So our Mishnah, which has a rule that says explicitly in our Mishnah. Shelo amru chachamim es hadavar lahachmar lelahakel. That's talking about Tchum Shabbos, which is Derabanan, and all other Dinei Derabanan. We are makel by a lot of other Dinei Derabanan, by Avelus as well, and by other areas. However, when the brisa that was just quoted in our Gemara says that we're supposed to be machmir, that's only by Dinei Torah. But again, by Dinei, that's why our Mishnah makes sense. This brings us to the next Mishnah. This next Mishnah, according to some of the Mefarshim, is really out of order. We've been discussing Eruvei Tchumen and we'll continue to do so, although this Mishnah speaks a little bit about Eruvei Chatzeros. So let's jump into this. This is actually the Mishnah that was quoted earlier in a brought as a side context in the Gemara, but now we're seeing the actual primary source inside. Ir shel yachid v'naseis shel rabim. If you have the city of a private person and it becomes public, so Machlokes Rishonim, how do you define a private city? Does it mean it was owned by one person? Does it mean that less than X number of people lived in it? So the Ramban was of the opinion that Nir Shal Yachid is I live in a massive multi-acre estate that's just mine, and I sold it to the city. So that's what this case is of Ir Shal Yachid v'Naseis Shel Rabbi. So what's the din in such a case? Ma'arvin es kula. There's no problem with making an eruv for all of that place. V'shel Rabbi v'Naseis Shel Yachid. Let's say that there's a very rich guy. He goes to the city and says, I want to buy West Rogers Park. So he takes a very public place and now he wants to privatize. So then ein ma'arvin es kula elim kein asa chutz ala ki ir chadasha shebi Yehuda sheyesh ba 50 diurim divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda was of the opinion that if you have a public place that you've privatized, you cannot make an eruv in all of it. You have to make something that has an exception to it, which is this city of, what's the name of the city is Chadasha. It's based on a pasuk in Yehoshua. The pasuk says, Tzinon v'chadasha u'migdal God. And this city had 50 people in it. And we wanted to make sure that people would remember that this is not a regular space. We needed to make sure that they knew that there needed to be Hilchos Eruvin here, because it used to be a place of Rabbim and you privatized. And now, how do you carry in a Rishus HaRabbim? I bought it. So I privatized, yes, but we make sure that people aren't going to make a mistake. Reb Shimon gives a more lenient approach. Reb Shimon Omer Gimel Chatzer Shel Shnei Batim. He says that all you need is 3 Chatzeros, each of which have 2 houses. That would be enough to allow you to be Ma'ariv in the rest of the city that you made from Rabbim into Yachid. All right, says the Gemara halfway down, Nun Testament a little more than halfway down. What is the case of a city that was owned by one person and made into a public thoroughfare? Answers the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Kigon Diskarta de Reish Galusa. It was again, this estate where the Reish Galusa lived. So that's the shita of Rabbi Yehuda in answer number 1. But Rav Nachman doesn't like this. Amar le Rav Nachman, my taima. What is the reason why you think that's the case? If you think it's because that there's a place where people are going to answer your questions, Rashi, the Meforshim here point out, this is the Hagos V'Tzionim, he writes, Hashilton Shel Makom. The Harmona is the person who is in charge. He's like the governor who would help you answer some of the questions that you had, whatever they may be. So if you're saying that over there, that's the type of city we're talking about, and people can be ma'ariv because midkirei ahadade will remind each other that this space is now public, and we put in an eruv, then that should be fine. But if that's true, then kulu Yisrael nami b'tzafa d'shabbos shchichi gabe hadade. But then any city that has Jews in it should be like that too. Rashi here highlights. Rashi says what is going on in the city of the Jewish people of b'tzafa d'shabbos d'shchiach hadade. 12 lines from the bottom. Lishmoa drasha. The rabbinic sermon is very old. On Shabbos morning, the rabbi would give a drasha, different model that we have nowadays. When I was in Smicha, they gave us public speaking classes on how to write a drasha and where the hook is and the question and the answer, and fine. And we're used to this format. And you kind of know when you're hearing a classically trained rabbi give a drasha, you typically can tell. So that's what the Gemara says here is diskarta, diskarta. What was it called? Diskarta de Reish Galusa says but that's what Rav Nachman was arguing, that if you're saying that it's because the Reish Galusa people used to specifically go there, every community had Jews going out on Shabbos morning. They'd all remind each other not to carry. So therefore, Rav Nachman rejects the shita of Rabbi Yehuda and he offers his own solution. Ella Amar Rav Nachman. What's an example of a private city that went public? Kigon Diskarta did not Zoe. This was a family name. There was nothing dramatic happening there. They just owned a lot of property. So they were the example of a private city. This also supports the Ramban's shita that the definition of a private city is something that's owned by one family. We're now going to start a brisa, which will carry us through much of the next amud. And each line of this brisa is going to require some analysis. So there are 3 parts of the brisa, and then we will go back and analyze each of them. Here's part number 1, Tanu Rabbanan. Ir shal yachid v'nases shal rabim, seemingly very similar to our Mishnah. However, Rishus harabim overes besocha, and there is a public. What is Rishus harabim overes besocha? What is it? Is it an ir shal yachid and it's nases shal rabim, and there's a Rishus harabim going through it? What's happening here? So there's a Rashi here that's very helpful. Rashi 8 lines from the bottom. Dibur hamaschel v'Rishus harabim overes besocha shall test zayin amo rochav. That's speaking about a road that is mefulash. Tes Zayin Amos is the sheer of width of a road that defines a Rishus Harabim. So it has to be from beginning to end, according to most, and it has to be at least 16 Amos wide. So let's go back to the beginning of this brisa. 6 lines from the bottom of the Gemara. Tana Rabbanan, Ir shel yachid v'naseh shel rabim v'Rishus Harabim overes besocha, and there's a street that's at least 16 Amos wide that runs through the middle. Ketzad me'arvan osa. How do we make an Eruv on that place? That's a Rishus Harabim doraisa. Normally we don't say you can make a Rishus Harabim doraisa into a carryable space. Answers the Gemara. Here we do think so, and we'll see why shortly. No problem. Just make a lechi and a kor. Everything's going to be okay. This, of course, is difficult because we don't normally assume that our Eruvin are not based on this principle, and we'll see how we hold in a couple of minutes.
Does our Eruv go to Western?
What?
Does our Eruv go to Western? I'm assuming that's what they're speaking about.
Western is a great example of mefulash, but the reason why our Eruvin are possible is because we typically rely on the opinions that that you need to have a concentration of 600,000 Jews in a 12 by 12 mil area to have a din doraisa of Rishus Harabim, and we don't have that in Chicago. We have a lot of people,
Right.
but that concentration is very uncommon. So this we discussed on Davav, whatever was in the Rashi there, about whether or not a Rishus Harabim is defined with the feature of having a concentration of so many people in such a small space. So even though it's true that Western is mefulash, whatever street is mefulash. A lot of streets are mefulash. Tui goes from the river all the way up. It's a very long street. So that would arguably be mefulash. It goes all the way through our city limits for sure, from water, almost from the water till here. Through here for sure, all the way till, I don't know how far it goes. It bends a little bit in Niles, I think, but by Romanian, a couple of small bends. But yeah, it's a very long street. So the problem, yes, those are mefulash, but they don't hurt our Eruv because our Eruv is solving a Derabanan problem. This is a Doraisa problem.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was case number 1. Case number 2, 3 lines from the bottom. You cannot partially be ma'arev a neighborhood. You either have to do the whole thing, or each mavui has to fend for itself. That's case 2. Case 3, last line of the page. Hayasa shel rabim, the harehi shel rabim. If it was of the rabim, and it still is of the rabim, the ein la ella pesach echad, and it only had one opening. Says Rashi, key language here. It's not a Dendoraisa location. It's only the Rabban. And then obviously Ma'arv and Eskula, that's halachically similar to our neighborhoods in that way, but for a different reason, that you're Ma'arv and Eskula. So now let's go back and analyze all 3 cases. Man Tana de Ma'arva Rishus Harabim. Case number 1 told us that if you have a Rishus Harabim, even with a road that's mefulash, tes zayin amos wide, that cuts through the city, that's a Rishus Harabim doraisa. Who says you're allowed to be ma'arev like that? So answers the Gemara, Amar Avuna Bered Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Huda. It's the Tana Rabbi Huda. What does Rabbi Huda say? This is a brisa we've seen a number of times. If you look up in the Mesoras Hashas, you'll see how many times we've seen it. We saw it on Daf Vav, Yud Beis, Daf Kav Gimel, on Daf Tzadi, and we will see it on Tzadi Hey, and we saw it twice in Maseches Shabbos on Daf Vav and Kuf Yud Zayin. So this is a very, very well-known brisa. The Tanya, 3rd line of the Gemara, the brisa writes, Yes, Al Ken Amar Rabbi Yehuda. If you have a house on each side of a Rishus Harabim, you're allowed to carry in between. How so? So this language is a replica of the brisa that we just read. So obviously, in our Tosefta, in our brisa, where it indicates that you can be ma'arev Rishus Harabim doraisa, that's clearly following the sheets of Rabbi Yehuda. However, the end of that brisa is how we paskin. That's what it says here. Amru lo ein ma'arvin Rishus Harabim bekach. So that's how we paskin. We don't allow it to be ma'arev Rishus Harabim doraisa. If we were ma'arev Rishus Harabim, it would lower the status from minister doraisa to minister derabanan. But to carry beheter mamish, that's not allowed on a Rishus Harabim doraisa. Not allowed. That was case number 1. Let's analyze case number 2. Omar Mar. Ve'ein ma'arvin osa ela lechatzain. What does that mean that you can only be ve'ein ma'arvin osa lechatzain, that you are not allowed to be ma'arev half of a city? Amar Rav Papa, that limitation of not being ma'arev a city halfway, lo amru ela leorka. That's only true to the length of the city. Aval lerachba me'arvin. But according to the width, we are ma'arev. What does this mean? So the Meforshim explain like this: if you have your road that is mefulash running up the middle of the city, you can't have the right side have an Eruv and not the left side, because since they both have access to the road, it ruins it for everybody. Because by Eruv Chatzeros, which is what we're familiar with, everybody's got to be on the same page. But because all of them will feed into that main Mefulash road, so therefore you cannot have the right half of the city on the right side of the road that's Mefulash to be Ma'arev with themselves, to the exclusion of the other side. It just doesn't work. Because in the overlapping space of the road that's mefulash, they ruin each other's chatzeros. So that's what Rav Papa is adding here, is that when the Brisa says that you cannot be ma'arev lechatzayin, it only means you cannot be ma'arev leorka on each side of the road. However, if you intersect the road, if the road is this way, and you have the upper half is going to be ma'arev and not the lower half, that's fine. That's fine. That's not a problem, because the upper half is sharing the same road. They have the same din. The right side and left side of the same din. So that's how Rav Papa understands this, our Brisa. Says the Gemara, Kiman, 8, 9, 10 lines down in the Gemara. Who is this like? It's the Lok Rabbi Akiva. This is not like Rabbi Akiva. Deika Rabbi Akiva, and we'll focus on this a little bit later in the Masechta. Deika Rabbi Akiva, he holds that when you have two chatzeros, one bleeding into another chatzer, ha'amar regel hamuteres b'makoma useres shelo b'makoma, that you cannot carry in both parts of the chatzeros where one broke into another one. So says the Gemara, that doesn't seem to align with us. So answers the Gemara, that's not true. Afilu tema Rabbi Akiva. Even Rabbi Akiva, who doesn't allow for carrying from one part of a chatzer into another, he would allow in our case, as we just said. Why? Because ad kan lo ka'amar Rabbi Akiva hasam el b'shtei chatzeros zo lifnei mizu. Rabbi Akiva over there, what was he forbidding? Only when there is two chatzeros, one that feeds into another. Tipnimis lesle pischachrina. The only way to get from the deeper chatzer to the less deep chatzer, to the outside chatzer, is through the only opening. So there had to be limit. There we were. What is he saying? Okay, there he says that it's not allowed. You're not allowed to carry to the next chaser. Aval hacha, here you can't compare the case that Rabbi Akiva was talking about with two chatzeros and the second chatzer is trapped behind the first one. But over here, by our case of this open city, aval hacha hani nafke b'hai pischa, v'hani nafke b'hai pischa. There's a lot of different openings. So just out of the gates, the cases are not comparable at all, and the Gemara rejects that. Ika d'amrei. There's another version of Rav Papa, going back, of course, to the second part of the Brisa, which we were discussing, that you're not allowed to do half Eruv in a city. So here's another version of Rav Papa. This is version 2 of Rav Papa. Amar Rav Papa, lo tema laorka hu delo ma'arvin, aval l'rachba ma'arvin. Don't say that you're not only allowed to be ma'arev according to its length, and that maybe you should be allowed according to the width. No, you're not allowed to be ma'arev half a city ever, even top to bottom. El afilu l'rachba nami lo ma'arvin. So says the Gemara, Kiman, who's that like? Rabbi Akiva? Is that also like the opinion of Rabbi Akiva? That actually makes more sense, because at least they both hold that it's forbidden in both cases. Says the Gemara, Afilu tema rabbanan. Even the rabbis who argue against Rabbi Akiva and are more lenient to allow for carrying within the chatzar, within a chatzar case, even the rabbanan would agree in this case. Why? Because halfway down, Afilu tema rabbanan. Ad kan lo ka'amri rabbanan hasam el b'shtei chatzeros zo lifnei mizo. Where were the rabbanan lenient in the case of one chatzer that it leads into another one? That's in a case where dipnimis achta ledasha umishtamsha. They have a door between them and they close it. So that makes the cases incomparable. Aval hacha. How do you remove the status of Rishus HaRabim from such a case that you can split it in half? There's no way that you're able to do that. So therefore, the Rabbanan would agree to remain strict in our case, like this new version of Rav Papa. Now we're going to analyze the third part of the Brisa on the bottom of Nun Testament Aleph. Says the Gemara as follows: Omar Mar O Kula O Mavui Bifnei Atzma. So that's what we said in the last part of the Brisa. the second to last part of the Bryce, actually. It's actually part of the second case. So if you look back on the bottom of the Testament Aleph, it says you can't do a half. And it also says you either should do kula, ela o kula, 2 lines from the bottom, ela o kula o mavui bifnei atzmo. So the Gemara is going to analyze that now. And the Gemara says as follows. We are approximately halfway down. So Amar Mar, O Kula, either you should be Ma'ariv the whole thing, O Mavui bifnei atzmo, every Mavui should take care of itself. Asks the Gemara, what was your rationale for saying that you can't do half of an Eruvin in a Rishus Harabim? Says the Gemara, Asrei Ahadade, because when they share the road that's mafulash, they ruin each other's chatzeros. So says the Gemara, if that's true, Mavui nami Asrei Ahadade. That shouldn't change anything. It should still be problematic for the Mavuis too. So how can you tell me that you're not allowed to do half and half within a city? Half yes is ma'ariv and half is not if they ruin each other. The same thing should be true about the Mavuis as well. So says the Gemara, Hacha b'maya askinan kigon da'avud daka. That's where you've made a change to the opening of these Mavuis. And that's where we're going to use a Rashi to help us. Rashi is about 3/4 of the way down, about 20 lines from the bottom of the page. Dibur hamaschel da'avud daka. What did they do to the doors of the Mavuis? Pesach namuch berosh kol mavui. They did something unique in that they lowered the opening of the mavui so that everyone would understand that this is not meant to be the regular mavui. It's meant to distinguish itself from other mavuis, and therefore, says the Gemara, it's not comparable to only being ma'ariv half a city. You're allowed to do mavui. That's not a problem. Well, with this change that the Gemara recommends of hacha b'mayaskin and can go to avudaka. And this is not the first time we've had such an idea. V'chihad amar Rab Idi bar Avin amar Rav Chizda echad mibnei mavui she'asa daka lepischo eino oser al bnei mavui. If you have a person who has one mavui and he makes the opening unique, he makes it lower so that it's more difficult to get in. So there we say, Eino Oser al bnei mavui, namely, every mavui can be seen on its own and they don't hurt each other, even though they do have a common area that they share. We're at the 2 dots, 2/3 of the way down. Hayasa shel rabim v'harehi. This was the case that we saw. This is case 3. Made a mistake in my when I presented this at first. This is case 3. So the Bryce on the bottom line of Nun Testament Aleph said, Haisa shel rabim v'harehi shel rabim. If something started out rabim, and it still is rabim, and then as we turn to the top of Nun Testament base, it says, Ve'ein le'ela pesach echad, so then you could be ma'arev everything. So let's go back to the 2 dots at the bottom. Says the Gemara, Haisa shel rabim, says the Gemara, Rabbi Zera, arva lemata, debei Rabbi Chia, below shavak lashir. He was ma'arev an entire city and didn't leave anything over. So how could you do that? It was he thought that it was a private place. Let's see. Amar le Abaye, my time avad marhachi. Why did you do that? That doesn't look like it's allowed to do that you can be ma'arev the whole city. Amar le Save Dida, the elders of that city, Amreli, Rav Chia bar Asi ma'arev kula. Because I was told that in a previous generation that Rav Asi was ma'arev the whole city. So I thought the same exact din was still true. I thought it was a regular case of an ir shel yachid that became public, which we are allowed to be ma'arev according to the Brisa. So it says the Gemara, Amar le lididi amru li hanhu sabe. Those older people who you're talking about, they told me what happened in the city, and things have changed. Hahi ashpa havala michad gisa. There used to be a pile of garbage. I guess this was like the local town dump, wherever they would keep everything. They'd keep all the garbage there, and it was blocked off on one side. The hashta di ipanya la ashpa. Now that they've removed the garbage, hava le kishnei psachim ba'aser. Now it's like it's mafulash. And that's a different case. You're not allowed to be ma'arev a city that's mafulash entirely without what our Mishnah said of adding the city of Chadasha or adding chatzeros that have 2 batim in it. So that's how the Gemara challenged this case of Reb Zera, and Reb Zera agreed. Amar le lavadaitai. I wasn't aware. I didn't realize that. So what it turned out is that a case that what Reb Zera thought was a city, an Ir Yachid that became an Ir Shel Rabim, was really an Ir Shel Rabim the whole time. It's just that in the times of Rav Chia, one end was blocked off with a dumpster. And now that the dumpster is gone, the whole city has a different status now. Now it's Rishus HaRabim, and Reb Zera made an error. So we'll stop here and pick up tomorrow night with a blot and a half. We're stopping 10 lines from the bottom or so at Boy Minei Rav Ami Bar Ada. Have a beautiful night.